Hello lovelies, in this video we're going through the top 50 quotes that come up in Romeo and Juliet. So what I want you to do is to focus on who said what, where they said it, what impact they had and why they said it. These are quotes you can really use to level up your essays.
Hello and welcome to this series of presentations analysing the language of Shakespeare in the play Romeo and Juliet. In this series we'll look at the 5 or 10 top quotes for each character. And we'll look at them in terms of the language used, analysing it in detail to help you get more marks in your exams, as well as thinking about the significance of the quotes in relation to the plot and the wider themes of the play. In this video, we will explore Romeo's top 10 quotes, and there are 10 because he is one of the main characters. Romeo is a romantic and passionate character who talks a great deal about love in the play, but he rushes in and takes things too quickly, often making mistakes that foreshadow a tragic ending. Romeo does develop throughout the play, however. He begins in love with Rosaline, but the love is unrequited. It takes him over, and it's childish and somewhat unrealistic. But then he meets Juliet, and his eye is quickly turned. He says he's never seen true beauty until he sees her. As well as being romantic, Romeo can also be funny and intelligent. We see him muck around with his friends, such as Mercutio, with lots of rude puns. But he's also got a dangerous side. He's prepared to fight to the death to avenge his best friend Mercutio, which shows he is loyal too. Much of Romeo's language is to do with fate, and we know from the very beginning, from the chorus, that he will in fact die once he's fallen in love with Juliet. He does develop maturity throughout the play, and has unflinching commitment to Juliet by the end. But he is a rash, impetuous person, and we see that behaviour does have its consequences. Our first quote comes from Act 1, Scene 2, when Romeo and Benvolio are discussing a potential party to go to, the Capulets' ball. Benvolio informs Romeo that Rosaline will be there, the woman that he loves so deeply, and says there will also be more beautiful women than her there, if that can be believed. Romeo, however, refuses to believe what Benvolio is saying, and he says, rather sort of sarcastically, "One fairer than my love," as if there could be such a thing. He believes there is no one more beautiful than Rosaline. The quote continues, "The all-seeing sun ne'er saw her match since first the world begun." Quite bold words there. He uses the imagery of the sun, this huge, omnipresent thing in the sky that's been there forever, to say that nothing or no one has ever seen more beauty than hers. It's not been matched, it can't be equalled. This extreme language shows that he really has her on a pedestal. He adores her and has this incredibly strong, unwaverable at this point, belief in her beauty. Shakespeare often uses imagery of the sun in Romeo and Juliet and throughout his plays. The sun is often associated with Christianity and resurrection, and can even be seen as a symbol of God. So the fact that he's referencing the sun and saying that nothing under the sun has ever seen her beauty is almost praising her in religious terms. As well as this, though, this quote really shows Romeo as a victim of adolescent love. It's quite immature and over the top in many ways. We know that his love for Rosaline is unrequited, so he's putting all his energy into something that is frankly going nowhere. Prior to the party, we see Romeo have some real misgivings, some real fears. As I said before, he often talks in this ominous tone, almost dreamily, and sometimes filled with foreboding, a fear of the future and a sort of premonition of things to come. It helps to keep the audience on sort of tenterhooks about what could happen, but we also know for sure that the deaths are coming. So this sense of foreboding is part of Romeo's calling card, really. The quote here is, "I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars." In the wider speech that this quote comes from, Romeo is looking uneasily into the future and has a premonition of death. I get the sense that Romeo has a feeling that perhaps his decisions will have consequences that could be bitter. His use of the word stars here, hanging in the stars, reminds us that he is star-crossed. That's what we learnt from the chorus at the beginning of the play. We know that he worries his fate is already written. Although he decides to go along with the others to the Capulets party, he says he fears it is too early. And we get this idea throughout the play from Romeo. He jumps the gun, he goes in too quickly, he's hasty. And so this is part of an important theme in the play. Almost everything happens too quickly. Juliet's marriage is announced too quickly for Romeo to find out and return from exile. The lovers die too young. Lots and lots of things happen hastily, which increases the chances of the tragedy occurring, which we already know has already been written. Shakespeare uses the determiner some when he talks about some consequence to show the sense of uncertainty. Romeo does not know what the consequence will be, but we do feel it hanging over him, it hanging in the stars above him, this something that could cause great consequence.
Our next quote comes from Act 1, Scene 5, and from the moment that Romeo first sets eyes upon Juliet. We can see here that he is the fickle character that I introduced at the beginning of the presentation, because some of the language he uses is very similar to the way he talked about Rosaline, who could never be compared to anybody else. And yet here we see that he notices Juliet immediately and sees her beauty, again, as almost incomparable. The quote Shakespeare uses here to illustrate the first moment of their meeting is, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright." And then there's a little bit more. And the last part of the speech is, "For I ne'er saw true beauty till this night." If you look up the scene yourself, you'll see that he says a great deal more at this point. It's a slightly longer speech, but I wanted to pull out these two lines as I think they're of great significance. The quote begins with, "Oh," a cry of passion, which actually originated in Greek theatre. It tells the actor who is performing the line that they need to sort of cry out in great passion, and of course, that is what Romeo is experiencing at this point here. He says she teaches the torches to burn bright. Perhaps Shakespeare's helping Romeo here to insinuate that the torches, the lights, the lanterns that would have been burning at the party, actually don't seem to be all that bright at all, if he then compares them to the beauty, the light that is Juliet. Shakespeare uses images of light and dark throughout the play in order to show love and to show fate and to show the difference between the darkness and the light in terms of the themes too. Here we are to see Juliet as someone truly radiant. He also uses the verb teach because it's almost like there's some competition here. The poor, pathetic torches in comparison to Juliet could be taught a thing or two.
Shakespeare alliterates the B's in this line, burn bright, which really indicate Romeo's passion. And then we also have beauty in the next line, burn bright and beauty. Some really strong sort of plosive language here that shows how Romeo is feeling incredibly strongly. We have the same effect with teach, torches, true and till. These plosive consonants give a real sense of certainty and passion to Romeo's words. He says, "I ne'er saw true beauty till this night," as in, I've never seen anything so beautiful or something so purely beautiful before tonight. And of course, we know he's already said this just about Rosaline. But he thinks he really, really means it. Saying that, the quote is full of hyperbole. It's extravagant and exaggerated. Romeo goes on to make several other comparisons that are extreme, such as cheek and jewel, snowy dove with crows, all of which are contrasts between light and dark. As I said before, light and dark are really important in the play, and often light is intrusive and gets in the way, it becomes an obstacle of some kind, it's powerful and it creates fear, whereas darkness is often soothing. It allows the players to get to know each other, to hide from their families, to act out their fantasies, and to discover who they really are away from their family's eyes. However, here we've got the imagery of the torches burning brightly, which becomes very positive in terms of the way light is portrayed. But also this beauty has been seen at night. His first sighting of Juliet is at night. So here there's a more innocent understanding of light and dark for Romeo. They have both brought him a sense of great passion. This next quote is incredibly important for the character of Romeo. It comes from the first meeting that he has with Juliet, where they are able to speak for the first time. The first 14 lines of their meeting are written in sonnet form. The first 12 lines rhyme alternately, and the last 2 lines are, as is traditional, written as a rhyming couplet. Sonnet writing was incredibly popular during the time of Queen Elizabeth, and Shakespeare wrote hundreds of sonnets. This writing is often used to portray a great love, and therefore it is fascinating to see that Shakespeare chooses this sonnet form to have the couple share this first conversation. Their back and forth creates this whole, this poem that is religious in tone as well as incredibly loving. The part of the sonnet I've pulled out here is Romeo's first 4 lines to Juliet. This is the first thing he ever says to her. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips, 2 blushing pilgrims stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. You may have learned in RE or in English that pilgrims were people that went on long journeys to shrines in the Holy Land to show their faith. They would come back from these visits with palm leaves that would prove they had been there, and so they were known as palmers, which Romeo later refers to them as in the scene. In his speech, Romeo is comparing Juliet to a shrine or to a saint. The verb profane is to desecrate or dishonour, an interesting choice of word from Romeo, and it suggests that he's going to take her hand with his unworthy hand, even though he does not deserve to do so. It could be disrespectful, but he seems to pull back from this disrespect by calling her a holy shrine, and he refers to his sin as gentle. It is a tender sin. It is not done with ill intent. And in case this gesture is met with offence, he offers his lips. He offers to kiss her in order to smooth what he has done with his roughness of his hand. And he contrasts rough touch with tender kiss. The adjectives rough and tender contrasting to create this passion. Religious imagery is peppered throughout their conversation. In this part of the speech alone, we see profane, holy shrine, sin, pilgrims, all suggestion of this love that is instant being heightened to this sort of religious fervour. It could be said that this is a love, albeit very new, that Romeo is determined to take with great seriousness with this comparison to religion and this worship of Juliet. It could also give us the sense that Romeo knows more about poetic language of love rather than actual emotions. It could be seen that this is an extreme reaction to seeing someone who he falls in love with instantly. We know he's quite hot-headed, but maybe here he's trying to show a more committed, more faithful, more mature side. Our next quote comes from Act 2, Scene 2, in which we see Romeo compare life to a dangerous journey. Romeo uses the image of himself as a merchant adventurer. He says he would brave any dangerous sea journey in order to gain Juliet. Pilot here is a noun that is what we would call a sailor. He talks about life as a perilous sea journey, a tragic theme that we see throughout the play. A feeling, perhaps, that he is pulled and pushed by the waves against his will, along for the ride rather than being in any kind of control. We can see that he refers to Juliet as merchandise. Some people might see this as a respectful way of seeing her as his property, as his possession, and others would see this as quite condescending, that he thinks he can own her as a woman. Of course, in Shakespeare's time, this could have been the case, but we see that Romeo is really seeing that he would take a lot of risks to gain her as his love. The quote, which is one of many references to Romeo being aboard a ship and on some kind of journey, suggests that he isn't a pilot, he isn't a sailor, so he isn't adept at knowing his way in many ways. And of course, he's young, and this is his second pronounced love. When Shakespeare uses the word adventure, he doesn't mean go on a great time and have fun. He actually means taking a huge chance. We see here that there's a real risk for Romeo in love, just as there would have been a risk for those adventurers who went off to try and find and discover new things across the world, including merchandise. Shakespeare uses adjectives like far and vast to show the lengths that Romeo would go to. Of course, he would go to great lengths to get her, but also this ties into the fact that he sees life as this dangerous journey on which he is just travelling at the whim of fate. Now, it feels like we've skipped quite a lot of the play here, and that's because there's so many good quotes to choose from for Romeo. So we skip now to Act 3, Scene 1, and really into the middle of the action. This quote comes at the point where Tybalt is desperately seeking to fight Romeo. He's furious with Romeo and his friends and men coming to the party and what he sees as disrespecting the Capulet family. Mercutio has been taunting Tybalt, and Tybalt has tried to ignore him because he's seeking out Romeo, but nobody on the stage knows at this point that Romeo has married Juliet. Of course, the audience do know, which is where the dramatic irony occurs, because we are clear that Romeo is in a very difficult position here. He cannot accept Tybalt's challenge to fight, but Mercutio will not understand this, and nor will Tybalt. It would be deeply insulting not to take up this challenge, and a real rejection of expectations. Mercutio would see this as incredibly dishonourable. So this quote then represents a really important moment in the play. It's incredibly exciting to watch if you ever get to see it on stage because of this complete difference in what's wanted from each of the characters on the stage at that point. Romeo says, I do protest I never injured thee, but love thee better than thou canst devise, till thou shalt know the reason of my love. And so, good Capulet, which name I tender as dearly as mine own, be satisfied. In literal terms, Romeo is saying here, I've never done anything to hurt you, and actually, I love you more than you're ever going to know, and you're able to understand. But I cannot tell you the reason for my love. And so, Capulet, who I respect and honour the name of as much as I do my own, be satisfied. And by be satisfied, he means I will not fight you. Please end it here. We can see a real semantic field of love here in Shakespeare's language. We have love several times, tender and dearly, good. So he's trying really hard here to show this tender, loving side, which really, really contrasts with Tybalt's language. Both Tybalt and Mercutio have been wound up to the point where they are really, really angling for an argument, a fight here. Tybalt refers to him as boy and villain, and he is accusing him of causing him great injuries. Mercutio, on the other hand, hates this dishonour, and he says, oh, calm, dishonourable, vile submission. So we can see that the other characters on stage are absolutely not in this loving, calming state of mind that Romeo's in. And we know that Romeo's in this state, which is completely at odds with the feud that is wanted because of his love for Juliet, his love for Tybalt's cousin, and his recent marriage that he does not want to put into jeopardy at all and knows he cannot share with anyone. So the secrets and the secrecy that surround his marriage mean that this becomes an ever more dramatic moment in the play. If we break it down a little more slowly, the word protest, the verb protest, seems to be sort of subservient. So he's bowing down to Tybalt and sort of saying, please, I submit a little bit here. I protest, I never injured thee. So Mercutio certainly would see that as weakness. But love thee better than thou canst devise. So he, instead of using violent, aggressive language, he says, I love you. This would really have shocked Tybalt. He then goes on to say, and so this is like a consequence at this point. And so, good Capulet, I'm coming to my conclusion here of my argument. This won't be a conversation that's ongoing. And so, this is where I finish. Good Capulet. So he's received him with love, with tenderness, whose name I tender as dearly as mine own. So I value it as dearly as mine own. Be satisfied. So there's an imperative there, be satisfied, but also done with admiration and respect, the complete opposite to that he's being met with. Now, this quote comes not very much further on in the play. After a scene of great violence, Romeo has survived the battle with Tybalt because Mercutio was hurt under his arm and has been killed. It's great tragedy because Mercutio was nothing to do with this argument, but couldn't stand the dishonour that would come from Romeo refusing to fight Tybalt. The quote here comes after Romeo has killed Tybalt in retaliation for the death of his friend. Overtaken with fury and a need for revenge, he kills Tybalt in a brawl, the one he was trying to avoid in the first place. We know by now that Romeo believes in the power of fate, and he believes he's controlled somehow by a greater force. Lots of the language we've already looked at, including consequence hanging in the stars, shows us that he worries that fate is against him in some way. The atmosphere of darkness in the play comes from this constant fear, this constant overhanging of fate, which is brought up again in the initial chorus at the beginning of the play. So the quote here is, "Oh, I am fortune's fool." And we already know that cry of "oh" suggests that sort of passion, but it doesn't have to be a loving passion. Here it's a sort of lament, a giving in, absolutely what has happened to me here. I am fortune's fool. A very simple sentence, and yet filled with meaning. He feels here that he is a plaything of chance, of fate, of the gods almost, that he cannot choose his own fortune, that this is what's happening to him. And so we see a bit of an immaturity again here, in that he sort of sees that life is happening to him and that it's not in his control. He, of course, killed Tybalt himself. It was his action that caused the death. But he gives in to this sense of fate controlling him. Fate was a central theme in much of Shakespeare's work, and certainly a dominating thought at the time in which he was writing. People were generally very superstitious and believed in the great chain of being, the idea that God ordered every living thing's place in the universe. So a little bit of a lack of responsibility if you look at things like that. And of course, Romeo and Juliet is one of Shakespeare's tragic plays. And in tragedy, fate is often a really important part and aspect of the play. The prologue, as we know, begins with the idea of these star-crossed lovers taking their lives. Well, some people believe that Romeo and Juliet's tragic futures were determined by mistakes and bad luck and mischances, but others believe it was written in the stars. Romeo seems to be part of the latter group. Our next quote comes from Act 3, Scene 3, in which Romeo goes to visit Friar Lawrence in his cell, and Friar Lawrence informs Romeo of the prince's sentence. He has narrowly escaped being killed, which is what was threatened earlier in the play. If there were any more brawls, he is to be banished. However, despite the fact that this is a much lesser punishment, the news absolutely devastates Romeo. Life for him is only in Verona and with Juliet, so exile may as well be death. In fact, in many ways, it's worse. The quote here is, "There is no world beyond Verona's walls, but purgatory, torture, hell itself." We don't have to look very far here to see a semantic field of hell. Purgatory, torture, hell, and no world, the existence of nothing. Without her, he may as well be dead. It's somewhat ironic that he can't imagine of a life beyond the walls of Verona, the city walls, because the walls are sort of what's keeping them in. There's a feeling of being trapped when we think of the imagery of walls. In Verona, the couple face many literal and metaphorical walls that stop them being together. The rules around them are sort of walls that keep them morally on the path of separation. And here, he's going to be sent beyond them. In many ways, this means the barriers between them physically have been taken away, but of course, he will not be with her. Separation from Juliet is no better than hell. Later on in the scene, he says, "Heaven is here where Juliet lives." So we've got the contrast of the hell of exile, of being sent away, of banishment, with the heaven of remaining here in Verona. Of course, he doesn't seem to see the irony is they can't be together freely here anyway. So, as well as the imagery of heaven and hell, we've got a sort of limbo for Romeo, and of course for Juliet too. Our next quote fits in heavily with the theme of light and dark that we've talked about quite a lot in this presentation. It comes from Act 3, Scene 5. At this point in the play, Romeo and Juliet have spent their wedding night together, Juliet in the knowledge that he has killed her cousin Tybalt, and that he is going to have to leave. He has to leave, of course, because he has been exiled, and if he doesn't, he will be killed. This scene is actually my favourite scene in the play, and so much happens in it. And it beginning with this romantic yet tragic goodbye is a super contrast to the conflict that occurs later on in the scene. The quote is, "Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops. I must be gone and live, or stay and die." These are Romeo's words to Juliet as she tries to persuade him that it's not yet dawn and daytime, and it's not yet time for him to go. He says at first that he must go, or he will be captured and killed, but they have quite a beautiful romantic back and forth about whether or not it is yet time, and they can try to steal a few more minutes together. As we know, light has symbolised Romeo and Juliet's love for each other. From the first moments they saw each other, Romeo used language of light to compare her beauty to that bright shining sun or lamps and other images of light. But their relationship is also full of images of darkness. We know that their relationship is doomed from the very beginning, and the imagery here continues along that theme. Romeo and Juliet can only be together at night. They have to hide in the shadows, hide in Juliet's bedroom with only the nurse's knowledge. Once it's daytime, they are in danger once again. Romeo refers to the stars as night's candles. Quite a beautiful and soft image, but he calls them burnt out. That feels sort of sudden and aggressive, a violent snuffing out of the stars and perhaps of hope. Shakespeare personifies day as jocund and describes it as standing tiptoe on the misty mountain tops. We have this image of a sort of proud and joyful person standing ready to greet the day, emerging from the mist and bringing this powerful light. What should be a joyful image, however, heralds something far darker. Romeo says, "I must be gone and live, or stay and die." This stark contrast between the choices he faces. If he chooses to stay with Juliet, it won't be for long. He will be caught and killed. And if he goes, he will live, but he will be without her, and that is almost tantamount to death for him. Shakespeare paints a rather bleak and sad but beautiful picture here, as the pair have to see that the future, if they're going to have one, is only possibly savable if he leaves, yet the audience know nothing savable here. Our final quote comes from near the end of the play, from Act 5, Scene 1, and once again links our character Romeo back to the theme of fate and destiny. Romeo says, "Then I defy you stars." This is in response to Balthazar arriving to inform him of Juliet's death. Of course, the audience know that Juliet is in fact not dead, but Romeo cannot know that. The plan for the friar to get the message to Romeo has failed, and so Balthazar's news hits him very, very hard indeed. He responds to the news with this phrase, "Then I defy you stars." It's as simple and as hard-hitting as the news itself. Of course, the phrase in itself is something of a paradox because the stars are inevitable. They're not able to be fought with or argued with, so his defiance of them is of no consequence, and he probably knows this too. But he wants to take his anger out on someone, and so he is once again talking to the fates, to the stars. This demonstrates some persistence on Romeo's behalf too, because he knows this is an impossibility. He doesn't know, but we do, that he is part of a pair of star-crossed lovers, and he has no control over his destiny. Others, of course, would argue that he does have some control, and his next step, which is to decide to kill himself that night in the tomb with Juliet, is not one of necessity. However, it has been set in stone by Shakespeare from the word go, and so this defiance is his final act of fury before he goes to the tomb to kill himself. Hello, and welcome to this series of videos on really important quotes from characters in the play Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. In these videos, we will be looking at either 5 for the more minor characters or 10 for the more important characters' quotes. We'll be doing a deep dive into the language in the quotes and their wider significance, both in terms of the plot and the themes that they represent. This video will focus on the character of Juliet, full name Juliet Capulet. Now, Juliet is one of the names in the title, Romeo and Juliet, so she's obviously going to be of great importance. She's young, yet she is intelligent. She is 13 years old, and she evolves throughout the play from a naive and obedient, well-behaved daughter to someone who is determined to get what she wants, despite the consequences being more than she would have thought she would like to pay. She becomes incredibly mature throughout the play and defies her social status and expectations, especially those put in place for her by a patriarchal society. She does not do what her father wants of her, and she does pay the price for this. Our first quote for Juliet comes from near the beginning of the play in Act 1, Scene 3, and it's one of the first lines that she has. Lady Capulet and the nurse are discussing Juliet's age at this point, and it's interesting to note that Lady Capulet isn't aware of her exact age, but we learn that she is not yet 14 years old. Lady Capulet wishes to speak to her daughter, and we'll talk about this further in the Lady Capulet video, but she's quite uncomfortable with this. The closeness between mother and daughter wasn't what it would be now. In fact, the nurse and Juliet are far closer. So Lady Capulet's words with Juliet are sort of witnessed by the nurse as she feels much more comfortable with her present. The line is, "Madam, I am here. What is your will?" We note from this beginning, Madam, this very polite and respectful term to her mother, that she is incredibly respectful and obedient. She does what she's told. She's respectful and she knows what her place is. She knows to address her mother in this very formal and very polite fashion. I am here because of course she would be here. Of course she would come when called. There is no doubt in our minds that that's her intentions, to do as she is told. What is your will? The final part of this quote, what is your will? What is your command? What is it you would like from me? Shows that she is there to do as she is told. It's clear that Juliet understands that there is a distant relationship here, but also one that is completely hierarchical. She has to do what her mother says. Although, as we'll find out later on, her mother is not the most important person. The true commands come from her father. As well as showing us the formality and respect in the relationship, this line and this address of Madam also shows us the lack of warmth or intimacy in the relationship. Again, as we'll see later, especially in the nurse's piece, we see that Juliet and her mother share a great formality, whereas with the nurse, it is far more informal and a lot more affectionate. Juliet here presents as an obedient and compliant young woman, absolutely living in line with what a patriarchal society would expect from her. Shakespeare does use some foreshadowing here, however. The formal tone here and her willingness to obey contrast greatly with her defiance later on in Act 3, Scene 5, when we see her stand up for herself against her parents. She later on turns into a far more self-determined individual, determined to follow her wishes and her desires and no longer follow along with what the family expect from her. But at this point in the play, in the very beginning, Juliet is following the expectations of Elizabethan times. Particularly daughters, but children generally, would have unquestionably gone along with what their parents wanted. Our next quote comes from Act 1, Scene 5, the ball scene in which Romeo and Juliet have first met, and indeed fallen in love. Juliet's lines read as follows. My only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen and known too late. Prodigious birth of love it is to me that I must love a loathed enemy. At this point, Juliet is realising with great disappointment, fear, and goodness knows what else going through her mind that yes, she's falling in love, and yes, it's one of her family's greatest enemies. He is hated by her family, and this is a love that cannot be. And we can see the use of binary in this piece, in this speech from Shakespeare, to show us how difficult this is going to be. The many oppositions or antitheses that are used by Shakespeare here are used throughout the play, and we can see we've got love and hate, early and late, unknown and known, love and loathed. We can see those opposites showing us the extremes that her emotions are running at, and the contrast at which her real feelings go within the family situation. She cannot be with this man, this boy, and yet she desperately loves him from the second she sets eyes on him. Juliet's words sort of express an irony she experiences here and the conflict she realises. My only love. There's an extremeness to this line, my only love, the only one I will ever love, from my only hate. Seems like this is really unlikely and incredibly unlucky, in fact. And we've got that juxtaposition of love and hate reflecting the play's central theme of those opposing forces, love against this backdrop of a terrible feud that is going to destroy them all if they're not careful. And we can see her inner turmoil here. She's got an immediate and desperate, passionate love for him, but she realises his identity is going to be problematic. Too early seen unknown, and known too late. We've got a pattern of things being too early, as we'll see in the Romeo video. And knowing too late, it's too quick, and she's fallen in love, it's too late. The next part of the quote, prodigious birth of love it is to me, is an interesting choice of words. The adjective prodigious here means unnatural, a sense of foreboding, a sense of monstrosity, or to create an ominous feel. Juliet understands that her love for Romeo is something extraordinary, but she also senses that this is something of a curse. It's come from the hatred between their families. And so her love, which is deeply felt, is also, there's an obstacle in the way here of this sense of doom. Shakespeare's chosen to use the word birth here, something we normally associate with something new, natural, something very joyful. But here we've got the sense of this ominous future being birthed, this ominous beginning that is going to somewhat mark their love with tragedy. And we end the little speech here with the contrast of the feelings of love and loathing. Shakespeare, again, completely deliberately creating this antithesis, because although she loves him, this is not a choice she would have made. She can only hate this choice because it's going to bring about suffering for both families and herself. And she knows now that this is sort of set in a tragic cycle now that she won't be able to escape. Our next quote comes from Act 2, Scene 2, the very famous balcony scene. This scene is iconic and known the world over, whether or not you've read the play. The quote we have here is, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet," and it's spoken by Juliet. Shakespeare has Juliet do a few things here, including challenging some of the social norms that she would have grown up with. She's challenging the idea of family loyalty, of sticking to her own, of really, really showing respect and value to the Capulet name. She's questioning what's in a name, what is the real value of it? And in that, she's doing something very controversial. She's challenging tradition. She's challenging her place as a woman to do as her father tells her to and to be loyal to that father. She's sort of trying to reason with herself. She's in denial at this point of the significance of the name. She's saying Romeo's name, if it was any different, wouldn't change who he is and what she feels for him. Of all the flowers Shakespeare could have chosen, he's chosen here a rose. The imagery is incredibly important. A rose is a romantic symbol, a deep blood red, passionate. It's incredibly sweet smelling and intricate in terms of its flower, but it's also covered in thorns. Perhaps a little warning there that this love is going to contain some danger as well as some real deliciousness for them both. It's a symbol of perfection, and of course at this point, just having met him, she's completely got him on a pedestal and imagining him to be something that is truly perfect. At this point in the play, Juliet is really struggling. Her love for Romeo is putting her in complete opposition to her family, which would be very, very painful. She's trying to minimise the significance of his name, which is actually huge in reality. She's trying to explore the name and say it doesn't matter. What's in a name is now a sort of popular saying, isn't it? Like, what's in a label? So what she's doing is actually sort of groundbreaking. She's trying to break free of some of the walls that have been put around her in terms of how she behaves. But we could also say it's incredibly naive. That is his name, and this is the reality. Our next quote comes from later in the balcony scene. Juliet is clearly fearful of the suddenness of their love and approaches the new romantic situation she finds herself in with a little bit of caution at this point. We think about the fact that there's been a lot of hurriedness, references to time passing quickly, things being done in haste throughout the play, and this is a moment where she realises that for herself. The quote is, "Although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning." This quote clearly here shows Juliet's mixed emotions about the speed at which this is happening. She's met Romeo, he's her newfound love, and yet things could go too quickly. The first part of the quote, "Although I joy in thee," we see there's a little caveat at the beginning, although. So I do find you gorgeous. I am falling in love with you. This has brought me great pleasure. But although we have that little bit of self-awareness, that little bit of caution at the start of the quote. She's acknowledging that she feels very intensely, but she's also asking him to consider, or telling him of her consideration, that we can't commit too quickly, too hasty. There's danger in it. So the second line contains some certainty. I have no joy of this contract tonight. I do not want to move things at a quick pace. And then she speaks in a very sure way. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning. This repeated adverb too, which could be about excess, really shows us that she is fearful here. She doesn't want to move too quickly. Too rash makes it feel like this could be a very dangerous decision. Unadvised, she's 13 years old. No parent, no adult would advise her to do this. So she is aware this is a out of character thing to do and a dangerous thing to do. The fact that she compares it, or Shakespeare, I should say, compares it to lightning is very interesting. We associate lightning with a bolt out of the blue, something sudden, something potentially dangerous, a flash in the night that goes just as quickly. And it's, I think, the fact that she doesn't want this to end quickly either, that's also why this imagery is so important. This line comes after Romeo has already made his vow of love for Juliet. Her response shows us that she is fearful and she worries that there is an unsustainability to their love if they do move so quickly. But she also wants to reciprocate his commitment, which we find out shortly. She's got this real internal struggle between her youthful passion and this moment of breaking free, and also her emerging sense of responsibility and maturity, which makes her a really interesting character. Our next quote, Act 3, Scene 2, at a really important part of the play. Murder has just occurred. Tybalt is dead, and Romeo is the one who has killed her cousin. Mercutio dead too. An absolute sea of blood has been created, and Juliet is simply waiting for her Romeo to come and see her after their wedding earlier that day. She has no idea of the murders that have happened across the city. I've taken a few lines here from Juliet's soliloquy as she waits for Romeo. The soliloquy is quite long and it does reveal the depths of her longing for Romeo. It's quite an interesting speech more generally, actually, because it's full of passion and impatience, absolutely not becoming of a woman in Shakespeare's time. If we just take it line by line, so we start with "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds." There's lots of commanding language here. She's full of commands because what she wants to show us here is the image of fiery-footed steeds, these mythical horses, the idea that they pull the chariot of the sun. She wants to bring on night more quickly so that Romeo will come to her. These commands, these imperatives, gallop, show us that she is absolutely desperate for him to arrive. She's got a completely passionate desire to consummate their marriage. As well as the commands, we've got lots of language to do with speed and haste here. Haste, I should say, gallop and a pace, and this repeated come, come, come. These demands for night to come, for Romeo to come, and she says, "Give me my Romeo" later on. It's very demanding, commanding Juliet here. The line, "Come, civil knight," is again demanding, but she's referring to knight here as civil. This adjective suggests calm, gentleness, something very orderly and sensible. She longs for it to be night because it provides them with the privacy and the intimacy to be alone, to be together, away from everybody in society and in their families who may have something to say about it. So she wants night to come because it creates a sort of sanctuary, a sort of privacy and safe space where they can be alone. We can also say that as she asks for gentle night and black-browed night, there is also a passionate feeling here. Her words are conveying a really deep need to be with him physically, to consummate their marriage, and she's anticipating that with passion. This repeated need, though, also reminds us of her impatience with the slowness of time. And we know already that this hastiness, time does conspire against them, catches them up, rushes them into making decisions that ultimately lead them towards a tragic ending that cannot be avoided. We would normally expect to see possessive language, such as my, in a male speech, particularly in Shakespeare's time, but here we have Juliet saying, "Give my Romeo." Not only have we got that repeated imperative, give, we've got that possessive pronoun, my. Romeo is hers, she wants to possess him. And if we look at the rest of the speech, we can see that she talks about having bought the mansion of a love, but not possessed it. She wants to be with him, make no mistake. And this sort of open, passionate demand for him is quite interesting. Sometimes we found that in the Victorian period, some audiences would have been quite embarrassed. They would have found it quite sexual. And actually some productions cut this speech because these are lines spoken by a 13-year-old girl. So some people see this as a young woman really owning her sexuality and her love and her passion. And some people find it absolutely something to be not looked at, which is interesting. As teenagers yourselves, you might think of that in different ways entirely. Our next quote comes from that same scene and is Juliet's reaction to finding out that Tybalt is dead and that Romeo has been banished for committing the crime of murder. This must be a very difficult time for Juliet. She's just married this man that she's in love with and discovered that he has killed one of her favourite family members. The quote is, "Beautiful tyrant, fiend angelical, dove, feathered raven, wolfish ravening lamb, a damned saint, an honourable villain." Shakespeare here has Juliet speak in oxymorons, using phrases that create opposites next to each other in order to show that she has really conflicting feelings. Juliet is, of course, completely torn here between her deep love for Romeo, her new husband, and the shock and anger, disappointment and fury she feels for the actions that he has committed that have led to the death of her cousin. There's so much to say just about the first phrase alone. Beautiful tyrant. She references his outward, gorgeous attractiveness, contrasting with the violent act he has committed. A tyrant is someone who is horrifically controlling and evil and violent. So you've got that very soft, admiring adjective with this noun that's full of fury and pain. Similarly, Shakespeare juxtaposes fiend, this devil, this evil spirit, with the adjective angelical, referencing angels. And obviously when we think of angels, we think of purity, we think of heaven. So those two things in her mind having this conflict. She goes on in the same vein. Doves we associate with peace, and she calls him a dove-feathered raven. A raven is a bird we associate with evil omens and death. Wolfish, ravening lamb. Wolf, obviously, we associate with preying, with ferocity, with violence, and a lamb, something so pure and so innocent. A damned saint, so this religiously pure being going to hell. An honourable villain, this stealing, thieving, violent criminal, combined with the word honourable, this sense of respect and honour that she associates with him normally. These phrases that so cleverly use antithesis really show us the theme of duality that's in evidence throughout the play. Romeo seems one thing, he is another. She doesn't quite know how to feel, how to trust. And constantly in this play, love and hate, beauty and violence, joy and sorrow are constantly running up against each other. Juliet's language here mirrors this contradiction that's throughout the play and getting in the way. Romeo is both her love and, at this point, a real source of pain for her that she's not sure she'll be able to get over. We can see that her love is being tested here, but we also know from the chorus, from the beginning of the play, from the prologue, that they will marry and it will end in tragedy. So this is a moment of great dramatic impact, but we know it will change nothing on their route to the fate that has been set for them already. This next quote comes from Act 3, Scene 5. This is the scene in which Romeo and Juliet say goodbye to each other after the wedding night and before Romeo is banished. It follows a really romantic set of exchanges between Romeo and Juliet with lots of romantic imagery, and it comes prior to probably the most dramatic scene for Juliet in the play, where everybody eventually has abandoned her and she feels incredibly alone. The quote is, "O God, I have an ill-divining soul. Methinks I see thee now. Thou art so low as one dead in the bottom of a tomb." There are many doom-laden visions in this play, many from Romeo, and this time we see the doom from Juliet's perspective. She calls out, "Oh," that Greek chorus phrase that we know is a sort of lament, a passion. I have an ill-divining soul. She gives us a sense that she sort of had a premonition, a seeing into the future, and she's sort of cursing herself here for being able to do so. "Methinks I see thee now, thou art so low as one dead in the bottom of a tomb." So as Romeo climbs down from the balcony away to his banishment, she sees him low to the ground, and she's reflecting on the fact that he may as well be in the bottom of a tomb. She's had this premonition of death, of seeing him in his grave. Shakespeare uses this image of Romeo lying dead in a tomb to foreshadow the end of the play and, of course, the eventual death of both Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's words are hinting at a chain of events that will lead to their tragic end. And her premonition here is an absolute example of foreshadowing. Of course, these lines aren't just structurally important and helping us understand the whole of the play, but they also show us Juliet's emotional state. She is overwhelmed with despair, and she imagines Romeo dead in this deep emotional state. It shows us her deep love for him, the consequences that their love is going to face, and her fear of losing him. This fear, with her sense of inevitability there too, really heightens the sense of the situation being hopeless. I've said this before, but Act 3, Scene 5 is my favourite scene in the play. There is so much going on in it. It's the one I really recommend to look at in lots of detail. So the next quote we're going to look at is an aside that Juliet speaks when in conversation with her mother, Lady Capulet. She says, "Villain and he be many miles asunder. God pardon him, I do with all my heart, and yet no man like he doth grieve my heart." This scene is absolutely full of double meanings because Juliet's now in a position where she has to lie or she'll be found out. She's sort of backed herself into a bit of a corner. Lady Capulet is talking to Juliet here and mistakes Juliet's tears for Romeo as grief for Tybalt's death. Of course, Lady Capulet knows nothing of the marriage and thinks her daughter is still crying for her cousin. These words are spoken in response to Lady Capulet calling Romeo a villain. The phrase that Shakespeare's put here aside, this stage direction, is incredibly important. What it means is Juliet is speaking to the audience. On this line only, she is speaking to the audience and not to her mother. So when she says, "Villain and he be many miles asunder," she is saying, a villain and my husband are miles apart. He is not one of those. He is not a criminal. She is saying that under her breath to the audience to show her certainty. She absolutely does not see him as a criminal anymore, or a villain, I should say, because he is her love, and something in her has found the strength to forgive him. We can see that little line at the end of the line, there's zero there, which is when she goes back to speaking directly to her mother. She says, "God pardon him, I do with all my heart." When she says this, she's sort of saying to her mother, God is the only one who can pardon such a villain. I agree with you, Mum. He is a villain. God pardon him. He's the only one who can. But she almost gives herself away then. She says, "I do with all my heart." And then, of course, she says, "And yet no man like he doth grieve my heart, doth give me pain, doth make me feel this way." Of course, the audience know when she refers to Romeo as grieving her heart, it's because she misses him. It's because she's desperately sad without him. The grief she talks about is a loss, is a missing of him. But what it sounds like is no man has upset her, has caused her so much pain because of the murder. This enables her to speak in one way to her mother and to hide her true feelings, but to share some of that emotional truth with the audience. This conversation really shows us how Juliet has matured very, very quickly since the beginning of the play. She's verbally playing with her mother here, which can be amusing and also quite stressful for the audience to witness. She seems, on one hand, to condemn Romeo's actions, but she's also able to secretly express how she cares about him. If there was distance before the mother and daughter, there's certainly distance now. Another fantastic quote now from Act 3, Scene 5, that shows the extent of Juliet's ability to be deceitful towards her mother. The quote is, "Indeed, I never shall be satisfied with Romeo till I behold him. Dead is my poor heart, so for a kinsman vexed." If we take this quote one little bit at a time, we'll see some of the meaning behind it. So Juliet starts off by saying, "Indeed, I never shall be satisfied with Romeo till I behold him." This first part of the quote enables her to tell the audience and herself that she will not be happy until she beholds Romeo again. We can get that sense of confidence and certainty with the phrase never, okay? Shall be satisfied with Romeo till I behold him. The longer dashes either side of the word dead are what she is saying to her mother. It's like a little addition here. I won't be happy until I see him dead. It's very, very clever the way that Shakespeare has enabled her to tell us the truth, to tell herself the truth, but to continue to mislead her mother. It then goes on. If I add on the word dead again, it'll make more sense. Dead is my poor heart. Dead is my poor heart is a reflection, of course, on how much she is suffering without her husband. But her mother does not know that. And then if we take it into the context with the final part of the quote, so for a kinsman vexed, she's saying her heart is dead and no longer grieving for her kinsman, her cousin, Tybalt. Vexed means troubled here. So we've got these two possible meanings, one for the audience and Juliet, one for Lady Capulet, that enables us to see Juliet's real deceit. This ambiguous language allows Shakespeare to present Juliet as, on one hand, appeasing her mother and telling her what she wants to hear, that she's desperately sad that Tybalt has died and that she's desperately furious with Romeo and one won't be happy till he's dead, whilst at the same time secretly expressing her love for Romeo. A final quote from Act 3, Scene 5, where Juliet is at the peak of her disobedience and refusal to do as she is told. The line is, "Now by St. Peter's Church and Peter too, he shall not make me there a joyful bride." This quote is in response to her mother informing her that her father has decreed that she will marry Paris on Thursday morning. She has only been married to Romeo for a short period, and now this other marriage is coming up quickly. It's too quick, just like her previous marriage, and nobody knows she's married to Romeo. Now we have to remember to put this quote in context of the period of time it was written in. In Elizabethan England, it would have been very common for women, daughters, to have an arranged marriage set for them by their fathers, and their father's choice of husband would have been paramount. But we must remember, at the start of the play, Capulet felt she was too young, so the reasons for this marriage are not in her best interests. He wants to save face because the family has had some real tragedy. He wants to have this fantastic arrangement with Paris because he is a good match for the family. It's not really about what Juliet wants at all. Capulet has gone from a comforting to a furious father in a matter of scenes and, a matter of days. He is really, really distancing himself from Juliet here and setting orders as if she is a possession, not a human. And her response here is quite interesting. We saw Juliet using some really direct language in the scene after the wedding night, and here she does it again, but for a very different meaning. Now is very certain. And of course, so is the modal verb shall not, a phrase that indicates something mustn't happen at all. She talks to her father as if she has some say in the matter, and of course that is not his belief. Interestingly, and perhaps rather bravely, she swears on the church and on the saint too. She evokes God in her certainty of not doing this thing that her father has insisted upon. Or perhaps she is simply insisting that she will not be a joyful bride, the adjective joyful suggesting that even if she is made to do it, it will not be done with a sense of occasion and with love and romance. But really we're hearing here a flat out rejection. No, I will not be doing this. No, I will not be being that perfect little girl that we saw at the start of the play. No, I have my own agency now. No, I will not be following on with this patriarchal control as you have expected me to do in the past. Hello, and welcome to the latest in this series of videos on characters from Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. In this series, we will be looking at some key quotes for each character, 5 for the smaller characters and 10 for the more important characters. And we will think about the language in those quotes and what they say to us about the character, their relationships to others, and the wider themes of the play. We will look at the significant language and think about analysing them so that you're really confident in approaching these quotes in the exam. In today's video, we'll look at the character of Mercutio. Some people say he's perhaps the most complex character in the entire play. He's friends with Romeo and he dies pretty earlier on. Sorry about that. Bit of a spoiler alert I needed there, perhaps. He is really entertaining, the Joker, if you like, of the play, and he provides some moments of real comic relief. He loves playing with language, making lots of sexual jokes and puns, often in inappropriate situations, such as with the nurse. He also feels intense friendship for his friend Romeo and has a really strong sense of honour, which would have been really something to have been admired when Shakespeare was writing. Some people have argued that Mercutio is such an engaging and entertaining character that Shakespeare perhaps killed him off early in the play so that he wouldn't distract from the bigger story of Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio's death in the play is definitely one of the triggers for Romeo to act as he does, and it sort of speeds up the tragic ending of the play. Mercutio's language isn't always the easiest to deal with, and we'll see as we look at it that it works on several levels. Our first quote comes from Act 1, Scene 4, the first time we meet Mercutio. This quote occurs at the start of the scene outside Capulet's mansion, where Romeo and his friends are preparing for their visit to Capulet's party, a party that they should not be attending. Mercutio is at this point trying to laugh Romeo out of his sadness about his unrequited love for Rosaline and help him to sort of cheer up and chivvy him along. In contrast to Romeo's rather sincere and serious approach to love, Mercutio is more playful. He says, if love be rough with you, be rough with love. Prick love for pricking, and you beat love down. He's sort of suggesting here that Romeo can dominate over love, can win over. He's saying treat it roughly, as love has treated you roughly. He's saying don't be frightened of it. Take it by the hand. Take it by the collar and give it a shake. Come on, you can get over this. Mercutio is witty here, but also shows his pragmatic side. He's quite dismissive to romantic approaches to love, and he is quite sensible at this point. He likes to live on the edge, and he worries far less about consequences or getting into trouble than someone like Benvolio. But he's also a very good friend, and he's trying to advise Romeo here to not take things so seriously. Our next quote comes from the very famous Queen Mab speech that takes place in Act 1, Scene 4. This speech about Queen Mab, Queen of the Fairies, is designed to create a sort of spooky atmosphere in the play. It's quite mystical. And we go from seeing this very pragmatic side of Mercutio to this very dreamlike side. But in this speech, he is dismissing dreams as unimportant, idle fantasies, things that can't take a lot of power over you, if you like. It's very, very mystical. And Romeo, of course, does have lots of points in the play of dreams and visions, but we'll see here that Mercutio takes a different approach. The speech itself is incredibly long and complex, so we're just going to have a little look at it now. If you want to have a little further look at the Queen Mab speech, then you should, because it's quite interesting for looking at Mercutio as a character. So Mercutio is dealing here with Queen Mab, as I said, who is this tiny fairy queen, and she has a real influence over people's dreams. She has this tiny chariot that we see earlier in the speech, is described as being like an empty hazelnut. That's how sort of small we're talking. And she rides this chariot across people's faces at night and influences their dreams. The quote I've picked out here is, "Sometimes she driveth over a soldier's neck, and dreams he of cutting foreign throats." Sometimes she driveth o'er a soldier's neck, and dreams he of cutting foreign throats. So here he's imagining Mab, Queen Mab, causing a soldier to dream of war and of violence, of killing his enemies, of going into battles, and general behaviour that would take place at war. He's creating this really vivid imagery here of cutting foreign throats. We've got that aspiration of what you would want to do at war, cause great damage to the enemy. So we've got this playful side to Mercutio here, but also quite a cynical view of what different humans want and wish for. And the characters that Mercutio reflects on, Mab visiting, all have these very different human desires that are also quite dark. He's reflecting here on the soldier having these very dark ambitions or desires of hurting, cutting, really violent verb there, foreign throats, of doing what he needs to do in order to fulfill his role as a soldier. It really contrasts with Mercutio's lively imagination that we see in other parts, and Romeo's really melancholic romanticism. Mercutio here is absolutely full of this imagery that is very, very dark and violent, and a really strange moment in the play. We could do a lot on this whole speech, but I think the main thing to think about here is that the speech serves to warn Romeo against fantasies, against a lack of realism that Romeo is sort of suffering with. It also foreshadows the violence and the death that's to come later in the play. It shows us that glimpse into Mercutio's witty character, but also the darkness that resides within him. And we also see the contrast between innocence and wildness in the play that's evident in the young nature of the characters, of the murders that occur, that real sense of both things being real. Our next quote comes from the beginning of Act 2, Scene 4. Quite an important scene in terms of the way the plot progresses, because we learn that Tybalt has challenged Romeo to a duel due to Romeo turning up at the party unwanted and uninvited. He feels he has been insulted. Mercutio is in, as usual, a pretty playful mood here, very mocking and very cross, in fact, with Tybalt, but we see him here in teasing mode. So the quote I've chosen is, "More than Prince of Cats, oh, he's the courageous captain of compliments." So he's insulting him here, and he is definitely teasing. He says more than Prince of Cats. So Tybalt was actually a popular name for a cat in Shakespeare's time. So he's sort of belittling here in referring to him as the Prince of Cats. Tybalt Tybalt is also, like a cat, fairly quick to anger, and it's also possibly an allusion to Reynard the Fox. Tybalt was the Prince of Cats in that popular story, and Shakespeare may have been referencing that. He's using it, though, to goad Tybalt into fighting. The very sharp alliteration that follows, courageous captain of compliments, also fits with this mocking tone. He's sort of laughing at his very precise style. His fighting style is really precise. He does everything to the book. He keeps the correct distance. He has a good sense of timing and proportion. So what could be a compliment is in fact being used to mock him, to laugh at him. He may also be mocking the way he speaks in this very precise way. And the repetition of that cutting C sound creates a sharpness to the insult. We continue in the same scene where Mercutio is no longer speaking in iambic pentameter, that very straightforward 10 beats to a line. He is now broken into a more prose-like form to maybe fit with his sexual puns and the more relaxed nature of the way he is speaking. Mercutio is pretty cynical, especially compared to Romeo. So here he's expressing his view that essentially love is sexual desire. That's what he thinks it boils down to. So he calls Romeo's love drivelling and says it is lolling up and down. So there's a suggestion that Romeo's romantic longing, romantic loving, is essentially sexual frustration. He uses a simile like a great natural, which is natural as another word for idiot here. And he uses this image of a sort of fool, an idiot, trying to hide his bauble in a hole, which implies sexual intercourse. A bauble, on one hand, can be a stick carried by a professional fool, someone who is paid to act the joker, or penis. And hole could be literally a hole, or it could be vagina. In Elizabethan times, we would use these puns in order to create comedy, and Shakespeare does that to great effect here. He could also, of course, be comparing someone in love to someone who is quite stupid, playing with a toy. It's going to cause you harm. At the very, very least, it's going to be a waste of time. So we've got this idea of something drivelling, something ridiculous and pointless, up and down, not going to have any consequence in the long run. So it's mocking of love. There's sexual teasing here, and there's teasing to a friend who he believes is wasting his time. Our next quote comes as things have moved along a little bit in terms of the argument between Tybalt and Romeo and his friends. At this point in the play, Tybalt has come looking for Romeo, and Romeo has married Juliet. Nobody else knows about this at this point. Mercutio is taunting Tybalt at this point in the play, and Tybalt is ignoring him because he is looking for Romeo, really. But here we see Mercutio, confident and stubborn. The playfulness is gone. He's got the eye of the tiger here. He's absolutely game on for an argument with Tybalt. At this point, Benvolio has once again tried to calm things, and Mercutio is not having any of it. He does not want to back down. He does not want to show any subservience to Tybalt, and he certainly doesn't want Romeo to do that either. Benvolio has just told him that they should go to some private place to talk. Everyone is looking at them, and of course we know what Prince Aeschylus has said. If there is any more public fighting, then they will be killed. So the line I've chosen here is, men's eyes were made to look, and let them gaze. I will not budge for no man's pleasure, I. So this is in retort to Benvolio saying, everyone's going to look at us. And he's saying, that's natural. That's what men are going to do. Of course they're going to look. Let them gaze. There's a willfulness to it. I welcome them. Let them look upon me. He is absolutely wound up and ready to fight here. I will not budge. There's a certainty to his words, and he will not listen to Benvolio's sense of calm and order. I will not budge for no man's pleasure, I. So the idea is, I won't do it for you. I won't do it for the prince, and I will not do it for Tybalt. I am not moving. It's a difficult one here because if Mercutio does not stand up to Tybalt, he will feel that lack of honour that is so important to men at these times. And yet, if he had stood down a little, stepped aside, perhaps the consequences that follow would not have occurred. But he is absolutely saying, I am not moving. I am standing here. I'm standing my ground. I will not be subservient to this man. So this next quote, a very short, quick one, shows how reactive he is in the moment. So the line is, "O calm, dishonourable, vile submission." And it always reminds me a little bit of when Tybalt talks about hate. I hate hell, or Montagues and thee. He is so angry here at Romeo because Romeo has just said, I will not fight you. I love you better than you know, to Tybalt. He's refused to fight. And of course, the audience know. We've got that sense of dramatic irony that Romeo is married to Juliet. So, of course, he's not going to fight her cousin. They're now family. But nobody on stage knows that. Oh, calm, dishonourable, vile submission is speaking to Mercutio's complete disgust. He cannot bear this idea that they will bow down and take it from Tybalt, that they will not fight back. He thinks what Romeo has done here is vile, is disgusting. He is angry with the calmness that Romeo is displaying, and he thinks he is being dishonourable. He is not standing up for his family. He is not standing up for their rights, and he does not like this lack of loyalty. He is actually incredibly cross here, and we can see from this single line that he is very much on the edge here. Romeo has literally just said to Tybalt, be satisfied, don't take this any further, this is an end to it. And this is his best friend's reaction. So far from pulling him away from the argument, Mercutio feels that they have to fight now, they have to end this, and Romeo's refusal to do so fires Mercutio up further. This next quote comes from Act 3, Scene 1, and shows Mercutio at his most antagonistic. He is really determined to wind Tybalt up here and try to goad him into a fight. I've picked out some sort of micro quotes here from a longer speech by Mercutio in the scene because there's some really juicy language to look at. So if we look at it in three parts, the part I've chosen to start with is Tybalt, you rat catcher, will you walk? He calls him a rat catcher, which is designed to mock and insult Tybalt completely. During Elizabethan times, rat catcher might refer to someone who could exterminate pests as a job, or it could also mock their low status. Mercutio is certainly using language here to try to gain the upper hand. We all know as well that Tybalt's nickname is Prince of Cats, which is a reference to a character from a set of tales, Reynard the Fox, and it refers to his cunning, feline, sly, plotting nature. The phrase, will you walk, is not designed to be friendly, an invitation of some kind. It is a challenge to a duel, to a fight. He also uses it quite flippantly here. So he sort of makes it sound more playful, as if it's a walk, but actually he does want something more serious, at the same time mocking the seriousness of this encounter. He then goes on to refer to Tybalt as good king of cats, and we can see with the adjective good, there's a rather mocking tone here. He's sort of looking down his nose, patronising him, good king of cats. And he's also referring to his reputation as a swordsman. He's well known to be incredibly skilled at swordsmanship, but he's also trying to belittle him and take him down a peg or two and mock his swordsmanship. The next line sees Mercutio become more demanding. Make haste, lest mine be about your ears ere it be out. So he starts with the imperative make. He's commanding him to hurry up. We might see him getting a little bit annoyed here. And he's also trying to encourage Tybalt to hurry up, to act more quickly than he has been. The next part of the quote suggests that Mercutio may well hit him, attack him, before Tybalt is able to even get his sword out and be ready to fight. We can see that Mercutio has become very confident here and is absolutely determined to belittle Tybalt. He's sort of implying here that Tybalt's being a bit slow and, by the time you get your sword out, I'll have got you. And Tybalt's got a really strong reputation as a good fighter. So he's using this language here to show him that actually you're not living up to my expectations of you or to everybody else's. These quotes are a really good mirror, really, for Mercutio's personality. They're quick, they're humorous, and they are antagonistic. He absolutely is trying to escalate things here, although the escalation that comes is far more tragic than perhaps he intended. This next line comes from the same scene and illustrates Mercutio's dark sense of humour right up until the point of his death. When he says, "Ask for me tomorrow," he knows he is dying. It sounds casual and it sounds flippant, much like we've heard Mercutio be before, but he knows that this is the end of him. So he's trying to sort of make a joke out of the seriousness of his injury, and his wit is still apparent, even as he knows he's going to die. "And you shall find me a grave man." He even manages to pun at this most serious of moments. Grave here can have two meanings. On one hand, of course, it could mean incredibly serious. And of course, normally he's very light-hearted and playful. So he's saying, tomorrow I'm going to be in a far more serious mood as I've been hurt. But there's also an irony there because, of course, there is no tomorrow. He is going to die. He is foreshadowing his own death at this point. He will literally be in a grave tomorrow. So there's a literal sense here as well as a pun. Mercutio, Shakespeare, is using a really strong juxtaposition here of humour and of tragedy. And that's what Mercutio's done all the way through in his role in the play. So this line is very famous. People know it very well because it's very near his final words. As we get closer and closer to Mercutio's actual death and his final words, we see him speak some real truth here. He says, "I am hurt, a plague on both your houses. I am sped." We can see here that all this talk of honour that Mercutio is so invested in has been completely pointless. He's tried to stand up for Romeo and tried to fight back against Tybalt. He also wants to prove the honour of the Montague name, which he has tried to do in this scene consistently. He says, "I am hurt," acknowledging the impact of the wounds that Tybalt has given him. And then he speaks as a curse, "A plague are both your houses." Now, the plague at the time in the Elizabethan era was obviously a very serious, widespread issue. Plagues and curses of this kind were an ever-present threat. Mercutio's wish to put this plague, this curse, on both the Montagues and the Capulets, the two houses he's speaking of here, shows how furious he is, shows how pointless this death is. He wants to really cause some destruction here on the two families and the argument that has caused his death. Of course, although Mercutio is firmly on Romeo's side, he isn't a Montague and neither is he a Capulet. So he's a character who can stand here and say, this feud is causing senseless death. Understandably, he is bitter and angry at this point because this argument, this ongoing ancient grudge, is really nothing to do with him. The final part of this quote, "I am sped," means he is literally fatally wounded and is therefore going to die. He's done. It simply captures the inevitability of his death that is now definitely coming. It's straightforward, yes, but its brevity also highlights how quickly things have turned around for Mercutio, this final acceptance of his fate, that he will be killed in this scene, and therefore will no longer be part of the play. Some critics and some audiences have reflected that Mercutio is killed by Shakespeare at this point in the play to highlight the darker turn that events will now take. He's also previously been a symbol of lightness in the play and a jovial feel that will now disappear. and his death is going to precipitate the death of Tybalt, and therefore the events that follow that inevitably unfold. We now come to our final Mercutio quote, and one of the final things he says in the play. He says to Romeo, "Why the devil came you between us? I was hurt under your arm." And we get a sense of blame here. Mercutio was trying to protect Romeo, and Romeo getting in the way has caused his death. The beginning phrase of the quote, "Why the devil," shows him questioning, and invoking the devil shows the strength of feeling he has around this. He's really, really frustrated and angry with Romeo at this point, who is only in this position because Romeo refused to fight. Of course, Mercutio does not know the reason why Romeo, who says he thought it was for the best, stood in the way, and Romeo does not want the death of Tybalt or the death of Mercutio. But unfortunately, because of the secrecy around his relationship with Juliet, those things come about. So this question, why the devil came you between us, sort of reflects his shock, his fury, his anger. I was hurt under your arm puts the responsibility firmly in Romeo's court. And of course, Romeo's subsequent actions, which are to go and kill Tybalt in revenge, possibly stem partly from this blame that's put on him by Mercutio. We can imagine that the guilt would be huge for Romeo. At the start of this scene, we saw Mercutio as a mocking character, intent on insulting Tybalt and being playful and also aggressive. By the end of the scene, we see that mask has dropped away from his face, and we see some real emotional truth in Mercutio, as we often do on a character's deathbed. He is desperately, desperately disappointed that Romeo stood in the way and ultimately puts the blame at Romeo's door.
Hello and welcome to this series on quotes from Romeo and Juliet. In each video, we'll look at one particular character. The smaller characters will have 5 quotes, and the more important characters that have a lot more of a significant impact on the plot will have 10 key quotes. What we'll do is, in each case, we'll look into the language of each quotation and think about its significance, both for the language itself, but also its wider part in the play and the themes each quote connects to. We'll think about what each quote tells us about the character, and we'll link it to context where appropriate. In this video, we will focus on Lady Capulet. Lady Capulet is Juliet's mother and a really significant character in the play. Lady Capulet is incredibly ambitious and she wants Juliet to marry Paris. This will mean that the family can gain status and wealth, and she's also got interesting ideas on marriage. Of course, living in the Elizabethan period, Lady Capulet married young, and she thinks it's absolutely fine for Juliet to do the same. She doesn't make any attempt to stick up for Juliet when Juliet's father, Lord Capulet, lays down the law about who she should marry. In fact, she sort of washes her hands of her when she won't do as she's told. She shows very little sympathy for Juliet when she's upset about her cousin's death, and she's quite cold as a mother towards her. Juliet has a nurse to help bring her up, and Juliet is far closer to the nurse than she is to her own mother. Lady Capulet isn't comfortable around Juliet at all, and actually relies on the nurse to do a lot of the mothering for her. She doesn't seem to have much natural maternal instinct.
Although in many ways she's typical of a woman of her time, deferring to her husband to do the decision-making in the household, she's also somewhat unusual. We see that she has a real taste for vengeance. She can be violent and unforgiving in her thoughts, really wanting to see Romeo punished for Tybalt's death by death. Our first Lady Capulet quote comes from Act 1, Scene 3, and it's the first scene in which we meet her. In fact, this is the first time we meet her, and we see her and her daughter together alongside the nurse. Now, there's a reason why we're introduced to the three of them at the same time. Lady Capulet really isn't comfortable being alone with Juliet, and even though she needs to have a serious talk with her, she is not comfortable with asking the nurse to leave. Let's look at the quote. "Nurse, give leave a while, we must talk in secret. Nurse, come back again, I have remembered me, thou hearest our counsel. At the start of the quote, she demands the nurse leaves the room. Nurse, give leave a while. She's dismissed her because she wants to have a more formal, more private conversation with Juliet. And it tells us how distant they are, because actually what she needs is to bring the nurse back, because this level of private conversation is something that's fairly alien to her. So that demand, give leave a while, is short-lived. She then says, we must talk in secret. The imperative must shows us that this is something she's sort of duty-bound to do rather than feels particularly comfortable about it. Secret suggests it's something private, something personal, and then she remembers herself. Of course, the nurse knows everything private and personal about Juliet due to their closeness. So then she changes her mind. Nurse, come back again. I have remembered me. Thou's here's our counsel. So you can see she says nurse again, that repeated nurse showing her anxiety. Come back again. Another demand, another control. I have remembered me. And what she means by that is, I have remembered who I am in this relationship with you, with Juliet. I have remembered the truth of things. You can hear our counsel. You can hear our conversation. So we know this is a sensitive subject she's going to talk about, but she is not confident to do so without the nurse present. She sees the nurse as a sort of go-between between them, perhaps almost a mediator, and she can use the nurse to ease her discomfort in her relationship with her daughter. Now, Lady Capulet is an aristocratic mother, someone of the upper classes, so she wouldn't have, quite normally had this closeness with her own daughter. It would have been socially normal. The nurses, the governesses, and other women of that sort of level would have had more to do with the children. This scene is also important because it foreshadows what's going to happen later in the play. Juliet's distance from her mother and from her father and their lack of knowledge about what she wants and needs is going to be a problem for them later on. It's going to be one of the triggers that causes Juliet to lie and for the tragedy to unfold. Interestingly, this exchange comes off the back of Lady Capulet and the nurse starting the scene alone, discussing Juliet's age. Lady Capulet isn't actually sure how old her daughter is. The nurse has to remind her of her actual age. So we know from the very beginning, before we even meet Juliet, that she does not have a mother who has that maternal intimacy that a modern audience might expect. This next quote sees Lady Capulet get to the crux of the reason why she wanted to talk to Juliet. She brings up the subject of marriage, and she does so fairly directly. So the quote we're going to look at is, well, think of marriage now. Younger than you here in Verona, ladies of esteem are made already mothers. As we previously said, Juliet is a young noblewoman, born to a family of nobility, and it would have been expected that she would marry at a fairly young age. Women, and indeed girls, would not have had the luxury of choice in these times. They would have had marriages arranged for them by their parents, father really, in order to secure a social marriage that was befitting of the time, befitting of the family, so that the family could see itself gain in status, if not remain the same. The first part of this quote, well, think of marriage now, shows Lady Capulet as fairly determined. It's very direct, and it seems to be a call to action for Juliet. She's telling her, you need to think of marriage. And then the word now suggests it needs to be done fairly urgently. Despite the fact that Juliet is only 13 years old, there's some suggestion here that this needs to happen fairly quickly. It could feel as if it's just been dropped in here completely randomly, but of course Juliet would have been understanding that this topic was going to be mentioned at least soon. Lady Capulet reflects that young women, younger than her in fact, are already mothers. She's reminding Juliet that she has a social role to fulfill as both a wife and mother. She's actually asking Juliet here to think about what is expected of her and to live up to those expectations. As we know, one of the things Juliet does in the play is to rebel against this role and expectation, and she completely goes against what her parents wish for her. When she refers to ladies of esteem, she's referring to ladies like them, ladies of this higher class. And she's also reminding her that if she fails to do so, she will not be seen as so worthy by society. Her job as a young woman is to marry and produce an heir. When she says made already mothers, she reminds us, Shakespeare is reminding us, of the normality of early marriage and motherhood at this time. Lady Capulet herself would have married early and had her child early, and she has not had the ability to fight against that convention. So she doesn't question it for her own daughter. Shakespeare uses Lady Capulet here to show us the rigid structures of Elizabethan society, that Juliet has a role to fulfill, and if she fails to do so, there will be consequences. It's interesting that he uses a woman to do this. It almost tells us that women helped create this cage as well as men. Our next quote comes from Act 3, Scene 1, where things have moved along at quite a pace. We see far much more of Lady Capulet than Lady Montague in the play, but of course, as the mothers, they are of less importance, in quotation marks, than Lord Montague and Lord Capulet. Lady Capulet enters the scene after Tybalt has been killed by Romeo, and her words are filled with grief and a feeling of revenge, a desire for revenge. The quote I've chosen for us to look at is, "O Prince, O husband, O the blood is spilled of my dear kinsman. Prince, as thou art true, for blood of ours, shed blood of Montague." We can see that Lady Capulet here directly appeals to Prince Aeschylus and to her husband, Lord Capulet. And Shakespeare uses O. And the repetition of O, used 3 times here, shows how deeply distressed she is. She's got a real sense of loss here, and there's a sort of lament in her voice. The prince represents justice, authority, putting things right, and her husband represents love and fairness and support that she requires at this time. As she talks about the death, she refers to the blood spilled, this incredibly vivid image of his death and what it will symbolise. We've got that violent, visceral image of blood here, reminding us of the violence and tragedy that's occurring here and that is to come. She's got a real desire for justice, and she refers to him as my dear kinsman. That means he's a relation of hers. She then goes to focus more closely on Prince Aeschylus and refers to him, speaks to him directly, "Prince, as thou art true." What she's doing here is putting a spotlight on his sense of justice and fairness, reminding him this is his responsibility and that he can do the right thing. There might be a little bit of emotional pressure here too. She then says, "For blood of ours, shed blood of Montague." There's a little bit of a religious feel to this, that idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. She says, "Blood of ours has been spilled, shed blood of Montague." Either Montague himself or the family, we're not sure, but the fact that she's used the collective pronoun ours is really showing how she's saying this has had an impact on my whole family. This isn't just Tybalt, this blood of ours. This collective blood could also be a sense of honour for her, of nobility, of their family, of what they symbolise for the community. What's most likely here when she refers to Montague, though, is she wants Romeo dead. She wants Romeo's life in exchange for Tybalt's. Her appeal to Prince Aeschylus here is both logical, because what she's doing is asking for fairness, and it's emotional. So she's asking him also to punish Romeo for her.
We now move on to Act 3, Scene 5, my favourite scene of the play, in which Lady Capulet becomes rather unsympathetic, which may not come as a surprise given what we know about her so far. The quote we're going to look at sort of breaks up part of Lady Capulet's longer speech, and I've picked out the most important parts here. "What? Wilt thou wash him from your grave with tears? Some grief shows much of love, but much of grief shows still some want of wit." The rhetorical question here is sort of disbelieving and almost disgusted. She's saying to Juliet, do you think if you cry, you will bring him back to life? Because you won't. She knows how Juliet is grieving for her cousin. However, she doesn't know that Juliet's tears are also about Romeo. But even if they were just for Tybalt, This would be a very unkind response.
We know how Lady Capulet feels about propriety and what's right and proper, given her social status and circumstances, and she seems to be sort of weighing out what portions of grief are appropriate or allowed. Some grief shows much of love. So if you grieve a little bit, shows a great deal of love, but lots of grief, much of grief, shows some want of wit. So she's criticising her intelligence, her sensibilities, and she's saying this is not appropriate. So we really see Lady Capulet's true colours here. Further on in Act 3, Scene 5, we see Lady Capulet's real taste for vengeance. And although she can't reassure Juliet in an emotional way, in a mothery way, she does do so by assuring Juliet that they will have their revenge. Again, I've had to sort of break up this quote because it comes from a longer speech. We will have vengeance for it, fear thou not. Shall give him such an unaccustomed dram that he shall soon keep Tybalt company. She uses the collective pronoun here, we, probably speaking for the family, knowing that they will do something here. And she uses the word will, the modal verb will, with a great degree of certainty here. We will have vengeance for it, fear thou not. Do not be afraid, we will teach this man a lesson. And then she says it very straight. She says, we're going to give him an unaccustomed dram. And that is a dose of poison that would be unexpected by Romeo, that he shall soon keep Tybalt company. That sinister image there of Romeo's death, which she's not saying directly, but she's placing Romeo beside Tybalt, ironically, as they wouldn't want to be beside each other. But the idea that he will die, that she is going to make sure that vengeance is reaped upon Romeo and indeed his family. Our next quote also comes from the rather juicy Act 3, Scene 5, in which Lady Capulet speaks to Juliet after her father, Lord Capulet, has told her she will marry. She will marry Paris and there is to be no arguing about it or she will be out on her ear. Absolutely no support given. Now, we might expect a modern day mother to step in and support her daughter here, but Lady Capulet does not. Lady Capulet is supportive only of her husband. And we see here that in this scene, which is structured beautifully by Shakespeare, to see Juliet abandoned by everybody she loves, one by one, and finally by the nurse, she is also abandoned by her mother. The quote we're going to look at here is, "Ay, sir, but she will none. She gives you thanks. I would the fool were married to her grave." This short response of Lady Capulet's comes just after Lord Capulet has said, have you delivered to her our decree? So have you told her? The woman's job would be to give Juliet her father's instructions, our decree. This is what's happening. He lays down the law. And her response, you can see here, completely throws Juliet under the bus. She will none. She is refusing. She gives you thanks. A little bit of sarcasm here, perhaps. She thanks you, but she won't be doing it. I would the fool were married to her grave. She's actually saying here, I sort of wish she was married to her grave. I sort of wish she were dead in a way because she won't do as she's told. She refers to her as the fool, this noun being very dismissive, very derogatory to Juliet, her daughter, because she will not do as she's told. And of course, she is a pawn in this family. She is a pawn to be used to gain social standing, and she will not do as she is told. Lady Capulet is using a metaphor here, married to her grave. She's sort of saying she's not going to be able to have a life with this husband that we want for her, so she may as well be dead because, of course, a woman's place is to be married in Shakespeare's time. If we try to look on it a bit more kindly, she will be very frustrated here and very angry because Juliet is, in her eyes, throwing away her chance at happiness. You know, things are very up in the air in Verona at the moment, and Juliet is being given this chance at normality, an opportunity for the family, and she is absolutely not taking it. And so Lady Capulet also will be in fear of her own position and social standing and her relationship with her husband if Juliet does not do what she says. Another quote from Act 3, Scene 5 as we see Lady Capulet run the gamut of emotions. So the next one we're going to look at here is her being disowning and abandoning of Juliet, which again may not come as a surprise when we see what's gone on in the rest of the scene. So this quote comes as Juliet sort of begs her mother to listen to her. And she's saying, please help me. I can't do this. This is not what I want. It's almost like a woman-to-woman moment. And Lady Capulet does not do as Juliet wants. These are Lady Capulet's final words of the scene and are damning indeed. So she says, talk not to me, for I'll not speak a word. Do as thou wilt, for I have done with thee. So we see an almost physical washing of the hands here, a complete dismissal of Juliet. Don't talk to me. I won't speak a word. So she talks very directly here. The clauses in the sentences are very short, very direct. There's no typical Shakespeare flowery language here. No metaphors. Talk not to me. She directly insists, for I'll not speak a word. Do as thou wilt. So do as you wish, for I have done with thee. Literally saying, almost you are no longer my daughter. I can't help you. You will not be helped. So we've got this moment where Capulet has abandoned her. Now, Lady Capulet has abandoned her. Juliet is all alone really in this, and her mother, who you might think would be a saving grace for her, does not do as she wishes. Our next quote comes a little further along in the play from Act 4, Scene 3. At this point, Juliet is on the verge of having to marry Paris. But of course, the plan is in place at this point for the friar's potion to put her to sleep and make her appear dead. So she won't have to actually go through with it. However, Lady Capulet does not know this plan. And so in her eyes, Juliet is simply going to bed the night before her wedding. And we can see here that she is completely tone deaf and unaware of what's going on for her daughter. So the real disconnection between mother and daughter is evident here. She acts as if Act 3, Scene 5 never happened, as if this wedding is almost a joyful occasion. And even if it's not joyful, then certain things are going to happen that she feels able to make a little bit of a joke about. So the quote is, good night, get thee to bed and rest, for thou hast need. And what she's referring to here is that she needs to sleep because tomorrow she'll be married. And on one hand, she's probably talking about the wedding day. It will be very tiring. And also tomorrow night, you will be having sex with your husband. I mean, completely tone deaf as to what Juliet is going through and ignoring of her daughter's true emotions. Because again, even if she doesn't know about Romeo, which she doesn't, she does know her daughter is still hugely grieving and does not want to marry this man. So she's following what we would expect a woman to be doing at this time, following out the instructions of her husband, ignoring the real needs of her daughter. Our next quote comes from Act 4, Scene 5, at the point where the family, the Capulets, the nurse, and Paris are mourning for Juliet because, as far as they're concerned, Juliet has died. Of course, the audience know she hasn't. However, that's what's happened to the best of their knowledge. Now, this scene's really interesting because some people, when they make this play, some productions actually cut this scene because it's seen as quite selfish, over the top, a performative, a sort of artificial response to the death of Juliet, because all these characters have done nothing to help her, and yet they are mourning quite loudly and quite dramatically. And no one less so than Lady Capulet, actually. So the quote we're going to look at is Lady Capulet's response to the death of her daughter. She says, "Accursed, unhappy, wretched, hateful day, most miserable hour that e'er time saw in lasting labour of his pilgrimage." So we start with those 4 adjectives to describe the day, this miserable, awful day that she cannot believe is happening. And of course, those things are true. It is an incredibly unhappy, wretched, hateful day. But just a few minutes ago in the play, she is saying, "I would you were married to your grave." So we can't help but notice the sort of clang between those two emotions that we see here. Most miserable hour that airtime saw. So this is the worst hour that time itself, she's personified time here, has ever seen in lasting labour of his pilgrimage. So in all this journey that time goes throughout history, this is the worst hour time will ever have witnessed. So real hyperbole here in the importance of Juliet's life in the grand scheme of the world. But of course, to her mother, it feels like the world has ended, although we can't quite see this at face value, given how she's treated her. So she is using imagery here of time to show the huge impact of this death on her and her family and her despair. And of course, this is real, true grief. When she talks about the day being accursed or accursed, she means it is cursed, it is doomed. The unhappiness, obviously very miserable, wretched. It's almost desperate how unhappy this day is. And she's also sort of repulsed by a hateful day. This day that should never have come. But in many respects, it shows her naivety that something terrible wasn't going to happen. But lots of women did just get on with it, in inverted commas, and marry who they should have done, in inverted commas, to please their families. So perhaps Lady Capulet is surprised because she just did what she was told, and she expected that her daughter in the end would do the same. Our final quote for Lady Capulet comes at the end of the play. Act 5, Scene 3, after Romeo and Juliet have actually died. Lady Capulet comes to the tomb to view her dead child, and she says, "Oh me, this sight of death is as a bell that warns my old age to a sepulchre." Now again, we have a real outpouring of grief here. She is desperately sad to see her daughter dead, understandably so. But her response is once again a little selfish and smacks of her overall response being one of vanity. She talks about the idea of Juliet's death being like a bell. So this sort of simile of this warning, this ringing out that reminds her that she will die. She is going to die one day, that her old age is going to bring her to a sepulchre, to a death, to her tomb. So at the time when Shakespeare was writing, church bells would have been rung really slowly at a funeral or in a village to announce a death. And of course, that would have brought people to the funeral. And it could also be that Lady Capulet is imagining this bell summoning the people to go to her funeral. And the custom was that the number of times that the bell rang indicated the deceased person's age. So she is really with the idea of her own death, as well as the death of Juliet. And I suppose the play does make us think of that, doesn't it? There's so much death in this play. But it is interesting that on seeing her daughter's dead body, her first thought is her own death.
Hello, and welcome to this series of videos on the key quotations for the key characters in Romeo and Juliet. In each video, we will look at either 5 quotes for a smaller character or 10 quotes for the more significant characters, and think about their language. We'll dive into the quotes in detail, and we'll think about the significance of the words Shakespeare uses, both within the context of the quote, in the scene, and in the wider play, including linking the quotes to themes. We'll learn a little bit about the significance of each quote in terms of what it tells us about the character, and hopefully in time get us to feel really confident in each character and the language Shakespeare uses to present them to us. Today we'll be looking at Friar Lawrence. And in the video we'll look at 10 key things that Friar Lawrence says, and we'll think about the significance of those quotes. Now, Friar Lawrence is a really interesting character. A friar is a sort of monk or priest who does the sort of things those people would do. So he's able to marry people, and people will also go to them.
People might go and see someone like Friar Lawrence for advice or guidance, and Romeo certainly does this throughout the play. Now, many schools have debates, in fact, about whether Friar Lawrence is to blame or not for Romeo and Juliet's deaths. He's a complex character because on one hand, as a friar, as a really important member of the community, he's really respected and seen as wise. People go to him for counsel. But we also learn throughout the play that he has a side to him that is sort of reckless and also cowardly. He comes up with the plan for Romeo and Juliet to be able to stay together. And it's a little bit silly in lots of ways and open to things going very wrong. He doesn't take a very adult role in the situation when that's what it really required. He's a bundle of contrasts. When Romeo first goes to him and tells him about his love for Juliet, he's really surprised because he knew that Romeo was in love with Rosaline, and he counsels Romeo not to rush into things. He tells him to go steady. But then later on, at Romeo's request, he agrees to marry them and thinks that this will somehow solve the feud between the Montagues and the Capulets, when it's sort of clear that it won't do that. The feud between the two families is too big. His plans are risky. What he does with Juliet's life in terms of getting her to take the potion so that she will appear dead is really risky, extreme, and very dangerous. And in fact, in turn, it turns out to be deathly. Because the friar is so complicated, it's a good idea not to come down too heavily on one side or the other when you're thinking about him in the exam, because he does have different sides to him, and it's important to try to explore these, which is what we'll try and do in the quotes we look at today. Our first Friar Lawrence quote comes from Act 2, Scene 3, which is where we meet Friar Lawrence for the first time. The lines I've chosen here come from a quite long soliloquy in which Friar Lawrence is getting together flowers and herbs at dawn, trying to put together what he needs to create his medicines. The wider speech here is quite beautiful and sees Friar Lawrence look at the world in terms of oppositions. He uses lots of opposing imagery to describe what he's doing, to reflect nature, to reflect the medicines he's making, and to reflect that what might be good in some circumstances can cause bad in others. So he uses these antitheses of good versus bad to show these conflicts, reflecting conflicts that occur throughout the play. It's quite interesting to see that their ideas are so opposing, so extremely one side or the other. So in the wider speech, he's got day and night, womb and grave, vile and good. So he sees things in these sort of very stringent oppositions. Shakespeare's using this speech to show us that Friar Lawrence is reflecting that, like people, what he's doing in terms of creating medicines and poisons from flowers and herbs can do both good and evil. So both of those binary oppositions are at play in the world, and really we're getting a sense of the foreshadowing Shakespeare's giving us here that, there is good and there is bad, and that is going to be really central to this play. The quote I've chosen here is, "Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometime by action dignified." So the opposing images we have here are virtue and vice. Virtue, of course, being something very good, a very positive attribute, and vice being a sort of sin, a sort of addiction, a sort of problem. And he says virtue can turn to vice if it's not applied correctly. And vice can sometimes, in fact, become virtue if it's done in the proper way. Which is interesting because later in the play, Friar Lawrence is going to do something that he considers virtuous, helping Juliet get out of a marriage she doesn't want, but it's actually going to be a vice because it will end up killing her. So really, this is all about intentions. And of course, Friar Lawrence doesn't have bad intentions. He wants to help. But the problem is, perhaps in the way he sees things in such a contrasting way, he ends up hindering when really what he wanted to do was help. I love Friar Lawrence's next quote. So this comes from Act 2, Scene 3, 2. And Friar Lawrence has now met with Romeo and has learned about his love for Juliet. Now, because of the closeness of Friar Lawrence and Romeo, I mean, Friar Lawrence is almost more of a father figure to Romeo than his own father is. We see him sort of mocking Romeo for his fickleness in love. He's moved from Rosaline now to Juliet. And it's pretty common that a performance of this play, at this point in the audience would be laughing quite a lot, especially by the end of the scene. There's a lot of love between Romeo and Friar Lawrence here, and the pace is really quick. So the line I've chosen to speak from Friar Lawrence's longer speech is this: "Young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes." Now, Friar Lawrence has lots of little sayings like this, and it's a beautifully put, really succinct saying here, which shows a degree of wisdom, but also a little bit of a sort of cheeky sarcasm here. He's mocking Romeo here and saying, is that love really in your heart? Is that genuine and true? Or is this a beautiful woman that you've seen? Does the love, in fact, lie in your eyes? Are you perhaps being a bit hasty here? And is this lust rather than love? Do you really fancy Juliet? Because this is really fickle. I can hardly keep up. 1 minute it's Rosaline, 1 minute it's Juliet. In contrast with Romeo, who is in a real rush here, he's full of urgency and wants to marry Juliet immediately. Friar Lawrence, like his advice, is more cautious and thoughtful. So he's trying to slow Romeo down here and get him to really consider what he wants. But in our next quote, we see Friar Lawrence, just a few lines on from our last quote, changing his mind somewhat. And you can see the sort of cogs whirring in his mind here and thinking, perhaps this could actually do some good. And it's unclear what his motivations are. We can imagine they're probably, yes, to help Romeo, who he's got a lot of affection for. Maybe he does want to see the families repair their feud. And thirdly, there's a chance he's being a little selfish. Maybe he wants to be the hero of the piece. If he can bring about this marriage and therefore the end of the feud, perhaps he'll be seen as this great figure that's achieved the seemingly impossible. So we could see this as, yes, well-intended, but probably with mixed motivations. So the quote is, "For this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancour to pure love." So I've given the thematic title of this quote, Hope/Naivety, which again feels a bit like another binary opposition, because he's so hopeful here. He really does want this to be the thing that brings the families together, but it's also incredibly naive to think that this would be the thing that does it. The hatred between the families is deep and ancient, and a marriage between the two youngsters is probably not going to help. So he uses, Shakespeare I should say, uses the word alliance, and he's talking here about bringing the families together through this marriage. An alliance we might think of during war, that noun that we associate with soldiers or countries banding together. That's an interesting choice of words here. May so happy prove to turn your household's rancour to pure love. So again, we've got the opposites of rancour, hatred, and pure love. And things are more complicated than that, aren't they? I suppose Friar Lawrence's philosophy is very beautiful with these opposing ideas, but the reality is we live in the middle quite often, and he's trying to solve one extreme with another extreme, and it feels very unlikely. It's also incredibly interesting that he does say these words just after he said, "Young men's love lies in their eyes, not in their hearts." So he doesn't have enough evidence to know that this is a true love match, that this would be a great idea. And so we see that idea of Friar Lawrence's unquestionable wisdom is quite wobbly here. Our last quote from this scene is a brilliant, typical example of Friar Lawrence's wisdom. It's very helpful, it's very sensible, and it sort of encapsulates what I wish Romeo and Juliet would do in this play, but do not. And it's interesting that although these are his words, he doesn't follow his words with deeds because he does marry them very shortly after this scene. So his words are the last of the scene, as I say. He says, "Wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast." It's sort of words of advice to children in a way, and he's really trying to advocate for some thoughtfulness here. Slow down, Romeo. Romeo's words before, "I stand on sudden haste." I need to move quickly. Friar Lawrence tries to bring him down. They stumble that run fast. If you go too quickly, you will make mistakes. He's talking literally, but also there's a metaphor here. In life, we benefit from slowing down and taking things gradually and making wise and well thought through decisions. So his intention is to help Romeo to do that, but his deeds do not follow. Our next quote comes from a very short scene, Act 2, Scene 6, in which Romeo and Juliet have gone to see Friar Lawrence. Friar Lawrence in this scene is advising moderation in love, not excess, and he tries to be very balanced, moderate as he speaks to them. The quote we're going to look at is this: "These violent delights have violent ends, therefore love moderately. Long love doth so. Too swift arrives, as tardy as too slow." This is a sort of chunk from a longer speech that Friar Lawrence makes in this scene, which you can see as I've used that ellipsis there to show some missing lines. But I've picked out the key lines here, I think. It's interesting he's used the word violent to describe the delights, creating a sort of oxymoron there. Delights we associate as something soft and pretty and delicious, and he's used the adjective violent to describe them. So it seems he's saying, love gently, love moderately, because loving too hard, too fast can lead to a violent end. So there's some foreshadowing here going on. Shakespeare is warning us, is telling us, although we already know from the prologue, he's using Friar Lawrence to show us that, yes, this extreme love isn't going to end prettily. He's giving us this message that long love, long-lasting love, a love that can last over time, is moderate. And he warns against loving too swiftly, too quickly, and the problem also being similar to if we love too slowly, too tardily, we're late. So both extremes are not to be encouraged. He is encouraging them before their marriage to be moderate. And it's a bit like Friar Lawrence, the horse is bolted here. They are already loving quite extremely. He talks about joyous love earlier in his speech, like fire and powder. So this really destructive, very powerful imagery here, but also the kiss being like sweet honey. He's telling us that oversweet honey can become revolting. So actually we need to do this with moderation, and we need to do this with caution and love and care. But he's not taking into account that they are young, they are impetuous, they are going to do this. So perhaps his words could have been followed with the deed of slowing things down or actually not marrying them at all. Perhaps his wisdom here is not falling on the right ears. In Act 3, Scene 3, we see Romeo's response to being banished, and he's incredibly upset. Friar Lawrence is not happy with how he responds to it. In fact, he chastises him. So we've gone from him being very supportive, some would argue too supportive, to being really quite cross with Romeo and his reaction. The line I've chosen is, "Oh deadly sin, oh rude unthankfulness." We can hear here that the tone Friar Lawrence would speak this in would be sort of disbelief that Romeo would be so lacking in gratitude for what's been done for him. Romeo has been shown mercy. It was promised by Prince in the opening scenes that if there was any more violence, let alone death, that it would be punishable by death. And Romeo has escaped that. He has been banished instead of killed for his crime. Friar Lawrence feels that he has been incredibly ungrateful, and this is a sin to him. because his reaction is really quite extreme and not what Friar Lawrence would like to see from him. Romeo sees banishment as essentially the same as, or perhaps even worse than death, because he can't be with Juliet and therefore his life is over. But Friar Lawrence is scolding him. He's saying, look, your punishment has actually been really quite lenient. And I know you're distraught about not seeing Juliet, but this really will not do. We can see the exclamation marks he uses here to really underline how vehemently he feels. He doesn't just label his behaviour as sin, though. He calls it a deadly sin. And that shows us that he thinks this is a grave moral transgression in terms of religion, in terms of Christianity. Romeo's ungrateful response is really worse than rude. It's actually disrespectful. It's sinful. Later on in the same scene, Friar Lawrence switches to being comforting, or attempting to comfort, even though it's not really taken as such by Romeo. Friar Lawrence is a philosophical man, and he thinks that comforting someone through words is possible. He thinks he'll find comfort in the right words, and that's because he's a religious man who must frequently find comfort in the words of God by reading the Bible. He says to Romeo, I'll give thee armour to keep off that word, adversity's sweet milk philosophy, to comfort thee, though thou art banished. So he uses the metaphor here of armour. He's saying philosophy is your armour. Philosophy can protect you from this pain, from this hurt. And he calls philosophy a sweet milk, this metaphor suggesting that it's comforting, that it's going to help him in some way. Adversity, of course, is being completely beset by problems. And he's saying that these words will comfort you, will help you, will ward off this pain, which Romeo absolutely, he says his response is hang up philosophy, absolutely dismissing the advice. So Friar Lawrence could be seen as tone deaf here, just as Lady Capulet was. He's offering this comfort, but it's not able to be taken by Romeo, so is it even of any use? Perhaps he is not seeing here the enormity of Romeo's pain, which is what Romeo has taken to expect from Friar Lawrence, that he will understand him. Once again, we see Friar Lawrence really concerned with words, but perhaps not so much with deeds. In our next Friar Lawrence quote, we see him respond to Juliet going to him asking for advice. She simply cannot marry Paris, and she is desperate. At this point, she is threatening to kill herself. So Friar Lawrence is in a bit of a corner here. He really doesn't want to see anything happen to Juliet. Of course, he's involved in this now. He's married them. So he begins to devise a plan to prevent her marriage to Paris. Juliet does say she will do anything to stop this wedding. And so perhaps more vulnerable than she has been before, she actually does say, tell me what you've got for me here. So he is working with a very vulnerable young woman here who is probably going to listen to whatever he says. He says, hold, daughter, I do spy a kind of hope which craves as desperate an execution as that is desperate which we would prevent. Without saying suicide here, he is talking about her suicide. He is talking about an execution that he wants to prevent. He wants to stop her killing herself. He says, I spy a kind of hope, which makes it sound like this plan is almost separate from them. I spy a kind of hope. I've seen something, an idea, a concept that could help us here, perhaps even something where he believes that God has seen this hope. He calls her daughter, which shows how close they've become, or perhaps he's talking about her as a daughter of God. He uses the word craves and desperate, which really plays to the fact that Juliet really is desperate at this point, that she will do anything. And he sees that desperation and knows it needs to be met with a plan that is perhaps extreme. So he says, as desperate an execution as that is desperate, which we would prevent. So although this plan is not ideal, it's going to the lengths that need to be met when we think the alternative could be your suicide. So there's a meeting of her extreme emotion here. There's not a dismissal of it, but what he's saying is quite reckless and endangering her. And of course, she is so desperate that she won't see that. Our next scene comes a little further on in the play. We're looking here at Act 5, Scene 3, so towards the very end. And at this point, Balthazar is telling Friar Lawrence that Romeo is in the tomb. And when Friar Lawrence goes in, he's going to discover Romeo dead and Juliet beginning to wake up. Contrary to his advice of being calm and measured earlier in the play, we see him here become rather hasty and desperate. Panic has beset him now because there's an atmosphere of urgency and fear for him. He knows that something has gone terribly wrong, and actually, he has played a part in this. When the friar enters the tomb, we see now that he has lost that confidence of earlier in the play, that certainty with his opposite, and now he is frightened. He says, "Fear comes upon me. Oh, much I fear some ill, unthrifty thing." And this is before he's discovered the body of Romeo and, of course, Paris. When he talks about this ill, unthrifty thing, he's talking about something unlucky, unfortunate, something that really has gone wrong. So we've got that sense of him knowing before he goes in. We know that he's going to become cowardly shortly, and this is the beginning of that. He will, of course, be desperately sad and desperately upset that Romeo has died, but he does not act with a sense of order and control at this point. Bearing in mind he's the only person who knows the true story of everything, it would have benefited everybody if he could have taken a bit more control. This final quote from Romeo and Juliet for Friar Lawrence never fails to shock me, actually. I always think Friar Lawrence somehow will get it more right when he gets it so wrong at this point. He is really fearful of being discovered at the end of the play. And of course, he is responsible for part of this at least. So he leaves the tomb, asking Juliet to go with him. So Romeo is dead. Juliet is alive. She will not leave because of Romeo being in there. And so he says, "I dare no longer stay." The full line is, "Come go, good Juliet, I dare no longer stay." So he does not stay and look after her. He does not make her go with him. He leaves her. He abandons her. "I dare no longer stay." He really is quite frightened here, but he is absolutely not going to do the right thing here, and he simply abandons her. And Juliet, therefore, is incredibly isolated, and Friar Lawrence's actions have certainly impacted that. Not everybody would say that Friar Lawrence is a callous man, but he certainly doesn't think at this point. He reacts. Perhaps Shakespeare is showing us here true humanity. At the start of the play, Friar Lawrence was able to be a voice of reason, a voice of wisdom, a real confidant for Romeo. And by the end of the play, so much has happened that he is unable to think straight. And he makes very poor decisions, reminding us that we are all human. Hello, and welcome to this series of videos on Romeo and Juliet quotes. You'll find either 5 for the smaller characters or 10 for the more important characters, quotes which we will annotate together and have a look at their significance, both in terms of the language used and their significance within the play and the themes. This video will focus on the character of Paris, or the County Paris. County is just another word for count, really. He's a high-ranking nobleman and the man who Lord Capulet would really like to marry Juliet. He's rich and he has some influence, and he's also related to Prince Aeschylus, who, as we know, is the leader of Verona in Italy, where the play is based. Paris is a man who keeps his emotions close to his chest. He is very important in the play in terms of his place within the plot, and he creates a real contrast in the type of love he offers Juliet. He's far more conventional than Romeo, for example. He's very polite. He asks permission for Juliet's hand in marriage, whereas Romeo is far more passionate. But both Paris and Romeo do end up dying for their love. He's a smaller character and has less to say, but what he does say does have some significance. So we'll explore 5 of his quotes in this video.
Our first Paris quote comes towards the beginning of the play and takes place when Paris goes to see Lord Capulet to ask for Juliet's hand in marriage. The conversation prior to this quote is all about the Capulet and the Montague argument. And so we can see that Paris here is trying to bring the conversation back to his number one priority, which is marrying Juliet. Paris, or the County Paris, as his full title is, which is another word for count, is a nobleman and therefore will be seeking a high status marriage. This is a good marriage for Juliet if we think in terms of societal position. So what he's asking from Capulet is beneficial to the Capulet's family. The quote is, "But now, my lord, what say you to my suit?"
Quote begins with a coordinating conjunction, but this suggests he's sort of interrupting the conversation to, as I said before, put his priority in place here. But now, my lord. There's a change of topic here. It contrasts this idea of marriage with the conflict that's occurring between the two families. And there's a sort of importance given to it, a sort of urgency now, but now, my lord, back to me. He refers to Capulet as my lord, which would have been typical for the time to show Lord Capulet great reverence and respect. When he says, "What say you to my suit?" there's a suggestion that this is not the first time he's mentioned this concept. Suit is another word for a request. My suit being quite possessive, my idea of marriage. He wants to make sure that Capulet will consider him as a husband for Juliet and really puts the idea into our head early on in the play that this is going to happen rather urgently. Of course, when we get to look at Capulet, we'll see that Capulet's response is, "No, not yet, it's too soon." But this does foreshadow the marriage that happens between Paris and Juliet later in the play that happens in great haste.
Our second Paris quote comes from the same scene, Act 1, Scene 2, and is a sort of riposte, a comeback to Lord Capulet when he says that she's not old enough yet to be married because she's still only 13. Paris's line, "Younger than she are happy mothers made," simply means that women younger than her are already mothers and quite happy about it. We don't know how he knows this, of course. He sort of speaks for women here, that they would be pleased to be fulfilling this role at such a young age. He's probably sort of right. We don't know how happy they were about it, but certainly girls were married off at a much younger age in Shakespeare's day. However, it wasn't quite typical, or the norm, if you like, for someone quite as young as Juliet to be getting married. Late teens would have been more normal. Regardless of what's normal, though, he clearly wants Capulet to give his permission, and at this point seems to be successfully persuading him. Our next Paris quote comes from later in the play, after Tybalt's death, and things have started to dramatically change. The quote is, "These times of woe afford no times to woo. Madam, good night, commend me to your daughter." I've labelled this quote as insensitive, because he's visiting the family home to discuss marriage when Juliet is really, really grieving for her cousin Tybalt, who has been killed. He refers to times of woe, that's the loss of Tybalt, and no times to woo, that is to court her, to persuade her, to love her, to move towards marriage. And he says this in a sort of throwaway line, "These times of woe afford no times to woo." It's a little bit insensitive. And then he speaks with great politeness to Juliet's mother, Lady Capulet. He addresses her as Madam, "Commend me to your daughter." In some ways, this is a very polite thing to say, commend me to your daughter, remind me to your daughter, speak highly of me to your daughter. But there is a sort of demanding quality to it. Commend me. It's quite bossy and quite commanding. Our next quote comes in Act 4, Scene 5, when everybody finds out about Juliet's death, in inverted commas. And we see how exactly Paris shows his grief for his fiancée. None of the characters show themselves in a particularly good light in this part of the play. People have said that their reactions are sort of self-indulgent, selfish. Really, if we look at the language here, Paris's is no different. Beguiled, divorced, wronged, spited, slain, most detestable death. We can see a real sense of anguish here, but it all seems to be about him. In this list of verbs, we can see his reaction, that he feels cheated, that he feels as if this event, this death, is going to affect him almost more than Juliet, although we can see that he probably is also saying she has been wronged too. There's a sort of personification of death here. He refers to death with the adjective detestable, hated, and there's a sense that he blames death as this person, this creature that has taken his love away from him. It certainly does show his grief is strong, but it also reveals a selfishness about him that can't be denied.
Our final quote for Paris comes from near the end of the play, from Act 5, Scene 3. This scene is the one in which Paris visits Juliet's tomb in order to lay flowers, pay respect to his dead fiancée, and mourn. The speech he gives at the start of this scene is written in iambic pentameter, that 10-beat line that reflects the sort of heartbeat sound. And Shakespeare uses end rhymes throughout this speech in order to convey him as a really conventional lover. Opposite perhaps to that raw and wild love that Romeo shows, but of course there is some sincerity here. Some people see this scene as quite inauthentic, but the romantic imagery that Shakespeare uses to convey Paris's love is definitely there to show us that his grief and mourning are real to him at least. So the quote, which we can see as sort of artificial and formal, or perhaps a real reflection of really heartfelt feelings, is this. Sweet flower, with flowers thy bridal bed I strew. O woe, thy canopy is dust and stones. Paris's love is really evident here, and Shakespeare's perhaps setting the bar for Romeo to come in later in the scene and give us his version of grief. He refers to Juliet as sweet flower, this very tender and affectionate label that he gives her. Shakespeare uses flowers throughout the play, often to symbolise love and beauty and passion, but here they also take on a symbolic meaning of death. As we know, flowers do not last forever, and we get this image of impermanence and beauty. The action of strewing her bed, her bridal bed, with flowers makes that connection between the grave and the wedding bed. Her bridal bed, which would have been soft and hopefully romantic, is now a grave. He's covering her bridal bed, her grave, with flowers, and the canopy above the tomb is now stone, a stone covering of the tomb instead of the fabric that would have been covering her bed had she been married and alive. The noun canopy, which we associate with softness, has now become something almost hard. Dust and stones convey images of death, of finality, of burial. Paris uses the lament, "Oh, woe." It sort of conveys his desperation here and his extreme sadness. He does seem to be genuinely mourning at this point in the play and really sad to have lost this woman who should have been, by his rights, his wife.